If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People who live rurally, what's the scariest experience you've had that you can't explain? I grew up in the rural South, so naturally you hear and see a lot of weird things from other locals, whether you experience anything firsthand or not, but the weirdest legend is by far the Wolfman. I was staying with a friend for a few days. He lived in a little cabin in the middle of this huge farm, big enough that it's a 10-minute walk from the house to the nearest road, and the property around the crops is thick forest, with about 7 other houses making up the neighbors, who were also pretty far away. One night I was on the couch just watching TV. My friend hadn't gone to sleep yet, so the lights were still on. He comes into the room holding a little baggie and asks if I want to smoke with him on the porch. I agree, and we head outside with his 2 hunting dogs, and they immediately go off exploring. We were just relaxing and smoking, probably about 10 minutes just having small talk, when we hear one of the dogs going crazy. Soon after, the other one joins in and my buddy jumps up and starts trying to see into the fields. It's basically pitch black, but there's not much light pollution, so you can still make out silhouettes. About 5 yards from the tree line we see this big silhouette standing up on its back legs, and the 2 dogs nearby barking and growling at it. I immediately jump up and I'm like, holy shit dude, it's a bear. Because that was the first logical explanation my mind jumped to. I notice my buddy is just kinda staring at it, then he looks at me and says stay here, and then quickly goes back into the house. I listen, and watch from the porch in case it goes after one of his dogs. I wasn't sure what I was gonna do if it did, but I definitely couldn't just stand there. My friend comes back outside with a rifle, and calm as ever, levels it on the porch railing and takes one shot. It missed the bear, but the sound made it run off, and once it took off, my friend called his dogs back up. They were both pretty shaken up, and we went back inside. I asked him about it a few days later, saying something like, do you see bears around here a lot? He said it wasn't a bear, and that was pretty much the end of our conversation about it. A couple months later I brought it up to a mutual friend of ours, and she casually explained to me that they believed there was a werewolf or Bigfoot in that area that had been stalking the property and freaking the dogs out. Spoke to my buddy about it and he confirmed it. I still think it was just a bear, but the way they talked so casually about it and seemed to firmly believe it did sort of freak me out. I don't go over there anymore. My dad used to rent this house way out in the middle of nowhere. A good 45 minutes from any town. The closest neighbor was another 15 minutes away. On this property were several enclosures for raising pheasants. These belonged to the property owner, so my dad had no responsibility towards them, other than to notify the owner if he saw anything wrong. He was high school buddies with the owner, so they were on good terms. Well, one morning he notices something very wrong. In the pheasant enclosure furthest from the house, with a good 50 or so birds. Every single one of them had been slaughtered overnight. What was even weirder was that it didn't seem to be an act of predation. None of the birds seemed to have been consumed. Luckily the owner had cameras and they got to see what really happened. So sometime in the middle of the night, a man neither of them recognized had wandered onto the property. He made no attempt to approach the house, but instead crawled under the enclosure's fence and proceeded to catch and stab each pheasant with a knife while wearing a headlamp. They caught the entire event on camera, from him entering the property till he left early in the morning. The police were called, but nothing ever came of it. My dad was so freaked out from the whole event that he made us stay with our mom for several weeks while he slept in bed with a gun. The property owner tightened up security with new fences and alarms. He even bought some guard dogs. They were very well trained and super friendly to anyone who'd approach them during the day. Nothing ever happened again on that farm, and the bird-killing psycho was never found. I used to live in southern Arizona, way out in the desert mountains, not many people around those parts, and I've seen a handful of weird stuff. Top 2, I'll share quickly. I love sitting outside at night. There, you can see all of the stars with no light pollution to block out the sky. One night, sitting out back as I did, watching the stars, I happened to catch a light off in the distance in my peripheral vision, maybe half a mile away, beaming down from the sky and moving slowly across the mountainside. I watched it travel from one ridge to the next in a straight, steady line. It passed by me and kept going a ways, then vanished suddenly, just turned itself off. No sounds, no craft in the sky that I could see, just a huge spotlight beaming down into the mountains. It made a very distinct circle shape on the land and was a good 100 feet in diameter, I'd guess. The next instance was another back patio stargazing interruption, only this time, it was not anything quite so peaceful. It was a cool, still night and near pitch blackout, except for the light from the stars. The wind picks up a little and ruffles up the aspen tree, which makes a fair bit of sound when the leaves hit one another. Suddenly, I realized that there might be something walking up the back canyon, hard to hear through the wind in the tree, but it was definitely a new sound. With the wind blowing, I second guessed what I heard for longer than I should have, because what I thought was something moving through the brush was something indeed. And then I saw it, I heard it breathing. My eyes shot directly to the spot where I could barely make out a large dark head looking straight at me from just outside my yard. I could now hear its heavy breathing, panting almost. I can't say for sure what it was, but it was easily 3 feet tall, as its head easily cleared the short half fence I had around the property. In an instant, realizing that I have some type of large animal focused on me in the dark and it's only about 20 feet away, I got up and hurried inside. I have never felt that kind of fear or panic. I was a live-in caretaker for a 94-year-old woman with Alzheimer's for about a year and a half. She had moved into her daughter's home deep in the woods of middle of nowhere, Washington. Marie was prone to say weird things, like that her sister deceased, mother, deceased, and husband, deceased, were in the house or outside regularly. I had been working with dementia patients for a few years by this point, so it never bothered me. Marie was terrified of the woods. She would tell me about how there's dangerous animals out there and I could get lost easily, so I must always stay inside. She was also worried about her mother and husband having to travel through them. Again, this wasn't worrisome behavior given her health condition. I had been working with her for about 6 or 7 months when I would start waking up to her walking down the halls in the middle of the night. Sundowning is fairly normal for people with Alzheimer's, so again I wasn't troubled by this, but she started going to a specific window and giggling. Like she was interacting with someone outside the window. When asked what she was doing, she'd say, "My mother is out there." Kind of weird, but there's a different perception in her world now. One night in dead of winter, her daughter and I are awoken to the blaring of the house's alarm system. The daughter and I check the doors and windows, none of which seem to be disturbed or unlocked. The only thing missing is Marie. She is nowhere in the house. Panicked, I rush outside to find her while the daughter continues to search the house. No tracks anywhere, no disturbed snow, nothing. After 10 to 15 minutes of yelling/searching the woods, I start making my way back to house where her daughter was already in the process of calling 911. As I approach the house, I see Marie. Standing outside the window she normally stood at, giggling. There's not a single footstep in the snow around her, nor is she cold to the touch. She's just standing there laughing at nothing, didn't even know she was outside. Her late night window visits became more frequent after this, but less happy. She'd get combative with the window and scream at whoever she believed to be there. Then it just stopped one day. One of the last conversations I had with Marie before she passed, she told me to not let them take me into those woods. I hope they didn't. I lived and worked in the southern coastal town of Albany in Western Australia for a number of years, where my job required me to travel to various rural communities around the region. I was returning home along a very flat and long stretch of Albany Highway in the afternoon when I had to overtake a farmer in his old Australian for pickup truck. So far so very typical of traveling along your average country road, but as I pulled in ahead of him, I checked my rear view mirror as I always did, and even though this happened over 25 years ago, I can still vividly recall the absolute confusion when I saw there was no car behind me on the road at all. This wasn't at night, but about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. There was no sun in my eyes or shadows on the road or any roads he could have suddenly turned down. I was easily going around 110 kilometers an hour, which meant he was going about 9100 kms. I literally looked up into the rear vision mirror as I pulled into the correct lane, so I cannot believe he could have slowed down and turned into a side road at that speed, or without me seeing him. No trees, flat paddocks both sides. I'm still absolutely flummoxed to this day as to what happened. Even as I'm typing this, I'm pretty creeped out remembering how it affected me. It really was like something out of a Stephen King novel. This is the first time I have recalled this story since it happened. Weird and bloody creepy, but true. Last year we bought our home in a mostly rural county about an hour from our hometown. We are surrounded by woods. Super safe small town. Very little crime here, etc. I grew up in the city but have done lots of camping, and in the mountains. I am not easily spooked by sounds in the woods at night. One autumn evening last year, I was sitting out on my deck alone, looking at the stars, surrounded by the pitch black darkness that comes with living out here, my husband already fast asleep. As I'm sitting there, I hear this sound in the woods. It sounded like a very large animal, I mean huge, not like a large raccoon, but more like person-sized. I could hear it lumbering very slowly through the leaves in the woods right beside the house. The sound made me think it was someone walking on 2 feet, not an animal on 4 legs. The slow lumbering though, if it was a person it would have to be a zombie. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the lumbering, which sounded very close by given how loud it was. I couldn't see anything in the pitch black darkness, but the lumbering didn't stop. It seemed to turn, and again, slowly lumber off toward the rear of our property, which touches our neighbor's 70 acres. I'm thinking, our neighbors are big game hunters, so if that was a bear and it wanders onto their property, goodbye and good luck, bear, but I noped right out of there and back inside, just to be safe. I tell my husband the next morning, he immediately says Sasquatch sarcastically. We think that sort of thing is ridiculous, but I've been updating our friends on our new adventure via Facebook, so I jokingly posted that I'd heard a potential Sasquatch in the woods the night before. One of my longtime friends who lives in this county texts me and says he needs to talk to me right away. I call him back and his voice is pretty excited, starts going in about how there have been numerous Sasquatch/Bigfoot/ whatever you want to call it sightings in our county, and hits me with a link to a local news article from a day or two prior reporting a sighting not far from where I live. People in these parts legit believe these things are living in our area. Apparently my friends used to be a skeptic too, but after moving out here he delved deep into the whole thing, and now fully believes there is a Sasquatch family in our area, and that they have been to my home. Needless to say, I was slightly freaked. I do not believe in Sasquatch, but ever since I always take my dog when I go out at night alone. There have been times when he just won't leave the porch at night to use the bathroom when I know he is too. Seems like he senses a predator. He seems to be on high alert and clearly anxious about something. Before I'd have told him to get and given him a little shove toward the grass. Now, that's enough for me to go back inside. The scariest experience I had living in a rural area was when I discovered my horse was attacked by some creature in the night. You may say it was simply a bear or cougar, but neither of those are indigenous to the area where I lived. She was truly an enormous creature, and I can't imagine what predator saw her as being on the menu. She survived the attack, later died of old age. I got one. Growing up in rural Ohio, I lived on a stone road. I used to take the country roads to the closest town, which passed an old cemetery in the middle of a wooded semi-swamp. I used to pass there every day on my paper route as a kid in the 80s. Way in the back of the small cemetery was an old Washington monument-shaped grave that was broke at the base. The top section was a few feet away from the base. Every day I would lift that top section back onto its base and go do my route. The next day without fail the top section would be in exactly the same place. I did this every day for about 2 years. One day I looked at where the top section was laying and I saw a very small glint of white marble poking through the ground. I moved the grass away and the dirt away and uncovered a small grave of a dead infant that matched the same last name as the name on the grave. I never lifted the top section ever again. Every time I go visit home, which is now a couple thousand miles away, I go back to that cemetery and that top section is still laying on top of that infant grave. I walked about a mile from home to go mushroom hunting in a usual area. Walked through a field of goldenrod as high as my shoulders and was about to enter the woods when I felt something strange. I felt like I needed to go or I wouldn't get out of there alive. I didn't hear or see anything, but I had got goosebumps and I felt anxious when everything was fine before I reached that spot. I stood there debating and decided to go hunt somewhere else. I've gone back many times and haven't experienced that again. I live in an area that have bears, wolves, coyotes and bobcats. I've never had any problems with them on walks or hikes in the woods, but maybe that day would have been different, or maybe there was a bad person in there. I've learned to trust this feeling I get. It saved me many times, and when I ignored it I got hurt. Whatever was in there, I did the right thing in not going in. Okay, I have one that gives me chills every time I remember it. It's from my friend's grandma. If you have grandparents in the countryside, make sure to get theirs. They will always have at least one blood-chilling story. She was like 6 years of age and her granddad was taking her home in one of those wooden wagons pulled by a single horse. It was close to winter and a little late after dark, and they were on the same dirty road as every day when they came across a sheep in the middle of the muddy field. They stopped and looked around a bit to try and figure out where it came from or if there were any of the sheep herders around, but there was nothing and no one in sight. Then the grandpa decided to take it back home, cause the wife will surely be happy to know they have enough meat to carelessly survive the winter. He yeeted it in the wagon and the little girl was petting it and talking to it. They went on for another minute and the girl was going like my little sheep, and petting the wool. Then a blood-gurgling voice said the same thing. And it came directly from the sheep's mouth, repeating the same words the girl said but in a thick, growl-like voice and a taunting manner. The horse reacted and almost got them off the dirt road and he was screaming. The grandpa unfroze and grabbed the sheep and yanked it out of the wagon into a ditch by the side of dirt road they were on, and then they sped off. We previously lived in an extremely remote area of the Rocky Mountains on a ranch that was a Forest Service inholding, i.e., a 1,000-acre spread surrounded by thousands and thousands of acres of public land, no neighbors, shitty access, ours from the nearest town. One night I went bow hunting, accompanied by my good and faithful border collie Healer. We heard an elk bugle over a ridge, so we quietly climbed over and down to this skinny, narrow flat on the bottom. We holed up near a tree and rock as twilight fell. Across from us, less than 200 yards away but at the top of the opposite hill came the sounds of snarling. I could only imagine it was wolves fighting over something. I'm not sure, I've never heard anything like it before or since. They were mad, growling, snarling, fighting. It was absolutely terrifying. I had no idea if they could wind us, or if they were headed our way. My dog, who is an experienced hunter and has been on bear and lion hunts, and has never shown fear encountering wolf sign on the ranch, was petrified. He was silently begging me to go home right now, nudging me and trying to get me to leave. I was too scared to move, because I was afraid if the wolves or yeti or whatever saw him and came down for him, there was no way I'd be able to defend him with just a bow and the 4 arrows in my quiver. So I made him stay quiet until total darkness covered us, both of us shaking and trying to be very, very small. At that point the growling had moved further south along the ridgeline, and I was hoping they were far enough away they couldn't wind us. So we stealthily crept down to the flat hayfield below, and made tracks the mile or so toward home. Neither me nor the dog could see a thing, the darkness was total, and we were both freaked out and shaky. About a half mile from the house, my dog suddenly stopped in front of me and put up a defense, ferocious barking, squared shoulders toward the danger, absolute protective mode to keep me from continuing forward toward home. I froze but lifted my bow, even though I couldn't see a thing, and then something in the blackness moved. It was like black on black, and it gambled away. Whatever little tiny motion I could see, I recognized as one of our black calves, cavorting awkwardly away from my very angry dog. I started laughing and had to convince my dog that everything was a-okay, we had reached our own damn cattle. Let me tell you, if a dog can be sheepish, he sure was. Guests ask me all the time if I get scared after dark out in the sticks, and my answer is always a firm no. There's nothing to be scared of in the wilderness, the only thing I'm ever scared of encountering in the backcountry are humans. But this was the one exception in all my life that I was flat terrified out there in the mountains. 8 years old, in very 45 miles away from the nearest anything on top of a mountain, rural Appalachia, I was sitting on my couch with my dad at around 9 p.m. in winter, with freshly fallen snow, watching of all things sightings, an old 90s show about alien encounters which scared the absolute shit out of me anyway, and we heard a knock 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 on the window. Keep in mind it's pitch black outside, so whatever could see us but we couldn't see them. Dad told me to sit right there with the telephone beside me, and he ran outside with a mag light to go see what it was. He locked the door behind him and he had explicit instructions that if he didn't come back in 5 minutes to call the police. I was terrified. He went around the house and came back in, downplayed it saying it must have been an animal, but directly after all of this, he took the long-corded phone in the other room and called his best friend to come up and investigate. He thought I was zoned out on TV, but I was listening. He said, "I'm telling you, there was a knock like someone was knocking on the window to be let in, but there was no footprints. It's still scary and I'm in my late 30s now." Went camping with a group of friends for a few nights. A few left the first night, they were cold and got really wet when the rain came. The rest of us toughed it out for the night. Seeing the others' tent the next morning, we knew they were not staying that night either. It was soaked and so was all the stuff inside, sleeping bags, clothes, and whatnots. Night 2 is still rainy but not as bad as night 1. The others got a room about 5 miles away. We were all welcome to stay, however no one else did. About 1130 or an hour after bedtime, Jake's dog goes nuts. Barking, snarling, and carrying about. A couple of us decide to walk him and see what's what. After about 5 minutes the dog starts to chill. Cool bedtime, so most of us head in and a few chill by the dwindling fire. They decided to add some more wood and keep it burning as one of the girls felt a little freaked out due to the rain and the way Jake's dog went nuts. They were out there a while when one of the girls came to my spot and woke me. About 10 minutes before Jake's dog started again and they went to bring it for a walk, and the dog got loose. We called and called but all we could hear was barking and snarling. Oddly, this sound seemed to be coming from the area that was all lake. We went looking with lights and even used the lights in several of the cars to light up the area. Finally, we heard the dog whining and crying. The largest predator out here was maybe a coyote, maybe a pack of them. When we found the dog the next day, it looked like it had been skinned. Nearly every bone was broken in some way. The hide was never found and the teeth marks in the body were odd and large, much larger than a coyote would be able to do. The collar was still on its neck, however no skin. About 2 or 3 feet further off the trail there was a large burn area. The odd thing was we had been through there on the way to the site 2 days ago. This area had not been burned at all. We would have seen it. The area was pretty remote even from the motel being 5 miles away. There were no fires there and we would have seen them if there had been. Jake was very upset, obviously wanted to dig a hole and put his dog in it. Someone thought we should tell the rangers about what happened. One of the girls called the PD for the town. They got to the rangers and had them hike into us. They showed up around lunchtime. Not that anyone was in any shape to really desire food. B, to keep us busy and to be able to continue the camping trip and the hiking most of us did. The ranger advised us we could dig the hole or he could get help and get the dog's body brought out. We opted to dig. Really, Jake said this was the best option. So be it. Dug the hole and filled it, and the burned area. The ranger also asked us about the burned area. It wasn't very big, only the size of a car or maybe a truck. We continued the hike and the others joined us the next few nights. Nothing very weird happened the rest of the time until we hiked back out. When we came to our old spot by where Jake's dog was in a hole, the area had yellow tape up and the area around the path was blocked off. Completely. There was a chain link fence about 3 meters or 10 feet high, put up in a big circle about 300 yards or 300 meters from the camp spot. There were armed guards at the fence about 100 feet or 33 meters away, off the path. We went to them as this was odd. We also didn't know if we could continue this path to get back to where the parking area was to get our cars, as some had left the cars and the jeeps could only continue the journey into the woods where we went. Only the owners of said cars were allowed to follow one armed guard. They got the cars and met us by the highway later. They had been escorted to the cars and had to follow the different a guard in a jeep. The others had to find a different path out, and this is where we discovered the fence was huge and we couldn't see anything of interest. The others also didn't see anything either. At the trailhead, there was a government camper thing that I later found out was a command post type vehicle of sorts. There were several tractor trailer trucks with had trailers on the back. The best way to describe them was they looked like a mobile home without windows and a roll-up door in 2 places I could see. The top was flat and everyone's vehicles had government plates. We were told to leave the area, and did so, not before being told for not listening we could find ourselves locked up. It was prudent to just leave. Several days later Jake decided he wanted to go back, visit his dog and all that, and who could blame him? So a few of us went back with him. When we came to the area we were sure we had left the dog, as the cove looked right and the path in was right. We came to a clearing and the clearing had been bulldozed to flat earth, trees, gone, rocks, gone, dog body, likely gone if we looked in the right spot. I am not 100% sure. We never found out why, or what happened. We have been back a few times, but I live far from there now, so not in over 10 years. The last time we were there not much had grown there besides grasses and small plants, but no trees and the like, and that seems odd to me, given how thick the growth around this area is. The trails have also been moved from this spot and no one is allowed to spend overnights in this part any longer. The trails now start in a different place, avoid the water until much further in and around the lake. Our 2 normally placid black Labradors woke me up. My bedroom was on the ground floor, making an awful growly barking sound I've never heard them make, with real aggression and fear in it. We lived in the countryside with a huge common and woods out the back of the house. I went into the kitchen and they were glaring at the back door and making a big fuss. This made my hair stand on end and their obvious terror communicated itself to me. I grabbed a torch and steeled myself, thinking maybe it was an intruder, and armed myself with a fire poker and opened the back door. It was pitch dark, and as I opened the door both dogs shied away and ran to the other room. I poked my head and the torch out the back door, and just for a split second I saw reflective eyes of a really large creature somewhere up the garden, maybe 10 meters away. They blinked as they turned away and they were gone. There is literally nothing in England that can account for this. I slammed the door shut and me and the dogs slept in my bedroom half terrified. The local paper shortly after that featured an article about some unexplained sheep deaths in a farm a mile away from ours. They had been ripped to shreds as if by a large predator. I had a woman in red knock at the door. She was dressed like a church lady, wearing a red dress with matching blazer, matching red hat with netting and red heels. It was a trailer in the middle of nowhere. I felt a sense of dread, so I decided to call out what she wanted instead of opening the door. When I yelled to her, she didn't answer, but tried to open the doorknob. My brother came through the back door to get a pack of beer for his friends who were outside having a bonfire. He saw her, and went back out the back around to the side of the trailer and came back in. His face was ghost white and he told me in a serious tone to not open the front door. He also locked the back door and we went to his room. After a while his friends came looking for him and knocked on the back. He told them we were done and staying in for the night. After some prying about it, my brother told me when he went out back and around the side nobody was there, but could clearly see her through the window when he went back inside. We have a lot of superstitions about lost spirits as travelers, but this one just scared the living hell out of both of us. There's a good few. I'll start with the least paranormal. Was sitting outside goat watching. Suddenly I heard coyotes going crazy to the northeast. A constant warbly growl came from the same direction and drowned out the coyotes until the night went dead silent. I've hunted hogs, invasive bobcats, and just about everything else you can name that can be hunted, and I've never heard anything like it before or since. In my parents' house you can hear people having conversations through the walls, but when you start leaving the room you're in it stops. Everyone who visits frequently has heard this at least once. I once showered with the bathroom door open as the family was away. I heard the door open and my parents talking, laughing, putting stuff away. I hopped out to shut the door and finished up quickly to greet them, but nobody was around when I got to the kitchen. No cars, nothing had been moved or was missing. Bloodhound was undisturbed, but our small dogs were freaking out. Called my parents assuming they had just come back TP get something, and they told me they were still 2 towns away. When I was young, maybe 4 or 5, my mom would often sleep in the living room with me and my 2 sisters as a family bonding thing. We were watching King of the Hill on our TV set when my mom and I heard the ferret gate at the bottom of the stairs slammed. We gave each others a quick glance and she jumped up to wake my dad up. He found nothing wrong and there's no way to escape the basement but the stairs. Those stairs are carpeted, and with some testing done in the morning we found it took a lot of force to recreate that sound. I didn't experience this, but my parents tell me about it often. When my sister and I were very young, 4 halves respectively, my parents heard a loud banging on their bedroom wall. Deliberate knocking as they put it. They bolted up in bed, looked at each other, and my dad grabbed a baseball bat. Neither of us kids or the dogs we had at the time stirred at all, and the cops found no trace of anyone even with K9s. More recently, I was around 14 and had my desktop PC in our kitchen on the table because we had no desk for my room. Late night playing video games and I hear knocking. Ignore it at first thinking it comes from the game, but it happens again, and again, and again. Took my headphones off and hear that it's coming from the door between the garage and our kitchen at the other end of the room. I go to the door with a kitchen knife and see nothing. The knocking has stopped and I immediately go wake up my mom. She tells me to just go to bed and rolls back over, but it happens again. Clear as day, and we both heard it. She gets up to come look and still nothing there. Didn't happen again that night. My sister always said that late at night/early morning, 12 to 4 a.m., you could hear a woman screaming in the utility room in our parents' basement. Connected to a bed/bath, assumed she was just making it up for shits and giggles. 4th of July last year she comes home with her son, parties, passes out in her old room downstairs. I agree to listen for her baby until I go to bed. He's down with her, so she can get some rest. Hear crying, think it's the baby, so I go downstairs and open the door to what is clearly a woman absolutely bawling her eyes out from the utility room/bathroom. Sister and her son are sleeping in the main bed together, and are both asleep. I immediately shut the door and run back upstairs. I sat in the kitchen and waited for it to stop. Then the baby started crying, and you could immediately tell the difference between the two if you'd heard it. My family lived 2 miles down a gravel road and literally a cabin in the woods of MN. We had seasonal neighbors because there are resorts in the area as one drives closer into civilization. The nearest town was 30 minutes away in good weather. It was late fall, I was in high school. One night I was doing homework at the kitchen table. I stood up to get some tea and saw a person staring the window. I froze and they didn't move away from the window either. It was late fall, and seasonal neighbors up the hill would have left by August. I just assumed after that month my family was alone. So who was this? I ran to get my older sister. She didn't believe me until she went to the kitchen and saw for herself. She told my mom, who then called the police. But this creep. They backed slowly away from the window, in no hurry at all. For whatever reason, I turned on the deck lights. We had one of those decks that wrapped around half of the house. The person runs from the window, around the entire deck, and disappeared into the night. The police did come that night and then back the next morning. When they came back the next morning they found some oddities. They found mud track footprints leading down the sidewalk and up the back porch. The back porch, of course, had windows with no curtains. So he'd probably been watching us there too? They also found clumps of new sod. Mom did a house project, torn up, but also a clump was left on the porch. To this day we aren't sure who this person was. But I can tell you one thing. Our family doesn't ever mention that super creepy incident, but we are the type of people to always lock doors and shut blinds. Apparently, you just never know who's watching. I was hiking in NH during college and something happened that, at the time, was unexplained. I'd been hiking a few times before, and my 2 friends hadn't ever been, one from a beach town in FL, One just a city person from Long Island, but there was a well-known spot close to our college. It was a short hike, maybe 2 miles? But they were definitely unprepared. We got a late start and it was fall, so I remember grabbing a random flashlight I had laying around my dorm. They didn't think about that and underestimated how long it would take for people who'd never gone hiking to get to the top. We got there no problem, but about 10 minutes into our descent down, it started to get dark real fast. So I brought out my flashlight. All is going well until it starts dying. It was a miracle a college student had a flashlight in the first place, and this was a time before everyone had iPhones. I had a flip phone and they had Blackberries. We think we're pretty close to trailhead but still speed up a bit. It still wasn't pitch black, but it was getting very close and the flashlight was fading in and out. All of a sudden in the distance we hear a gut-wrenching shriek that wasn't human. If I remember, it was more of an echo through the trail, and it didn't sound too close, but what the hell did I know? The three of us were petrified. We didn't even say anything to another, we just all started running because we had no idea what it could be. It felt so surreal, to be running from an unknown thing, and then the only sound was of our feet hitting the ground, and it felt deafening to me. I can't even recall hearing any insects or birds in the woods, just footsteps racing to get the duck out. It didn't take us more than 10 minutes to get down, which was such a relief to see her car. We got in and just booked it. I barely remember the car ride back. I honestly think I blacked out in combo of post-adrenaline fear and relief. I do remember we didn't even talk about in the car, no WTF was that, or that could have gone really bad. I honestly don't think we said a word that night or ever again. It was too scary and weird to think about. My parents lived in a very secluded part of town, down a couple miles of backroads, away from everyone. It was a small little neighborhood, but everyone's properties were huge, so everyone was spaced out quite a bit. It wasn't uncommon to have people walking down the street, as we had a few houses up the road from us. However, one night as I'm out getting dinner with my brother, my other brother texts me and says, "Haha, very funny, stop fucking around and come inside already." I was super confused, as I was maybe 5 miles away in a Taco Bell drive-thru. I asked what he meant and he told me that he'd heard 3 very loud knocks on the back door. We lived in a double-wide trailer at the time, so the house was quite small and you could hear things outside from any place in the house. He called me, and as he was explaining what he heard, I heard over the phone 3 more very loud knocks. My brother went silent and told me those ones came from the window in the living room overlooking the backyard. At that point I pulled out of the drive-thru and started speeding home. I continued hearing the knocks over the phone as he told me which window they were coming from. The other living room window, the 2 windows in my parents' room. The windows in my youngest brother's room, who was with me, the front door, the kitchen and bathroom windows, and kept going until it got back to the back door. Every group of knocks about 45 seconds to a minute apart. By the time they started going around the house for a second time, I was pulling onto the street we lived on. I stopped my car in front of my neighbor's house, told my brother to grab the gun from my parents' room and lock the doors while I called the cops. I explained everything to them and informed them that my brother was armed. They show up roughly 10 minutes later, and inspected the property. No one. Not a single soul was on the entire property except my brother. He said the knocks happened clear up until the cops walked onto our front porch. How they didn't hear them, I'll never know. It could have been a person, just wandering around, and decided to mess with my brother and ran off in the darkness as soon as the cops showed up. We never found out what or who it was, but my brother refused to stay home alone for a few months afterwards. I move around the Midwest/West Coast every few months and have experienced some dumb and some weird shit. The weirdest shit that is the only time in my life that I generally felt truly concerned for my safety was at about 1 a.m. in between Susanville, California, and Reno, Nevada. In between these 2 towns/city is a string of small towns, and then about 30 miles from Reno there's a canyon. There's no roads or turnoffs in the canyon for miles. I was driving to the Grand Canyon and hated driving in Nevada in the day because of how ugly it is. Well, this night is weird because as I approached the canyon, the town before how essentially no power. The only gas station was 100% dark and the few houses completely blacked out. As I got into the canyon about 5 miles, I saw this black pillar/person looking thing at least a half mile up. I start to slow down and turn on my light bar, and I notice it's a person walking the side of the road. They are wearing a black hoodie and blue jeans. I'm about 15 miles from the nearest road/turnoff, and it was extremely unsettling. I pick up hitchhikers quite often, but seeing this person was odd. So as I approach/coming up closer to the person, they are walking with traffic, so I could only see their back, but as I got maybe 50 feet and was doing about 20 miles per hour, they quickly turned to look at me like a fucking hag and they hopped over the guardrail. I immediately floored it and was easily doing 110 miles per hour in that canyon. Was freaked out, yo. When we lived out in the country in Nebraska, it was about midnight when we turned off the TV and headed to bed. But when we went upstairs, we could hear this low rumble that sounded exactly like an idling car with a bad muffler. Maybe like an old pickup. When I opened the door, it became slightly louder, really as if there was a car nearby idling. I shined a flashlight around and couldn't see anything, but we lived on 4 acres and had various outbuildings as well as a tree line north of the house. The sound persisted to the point that we finally called the police. 2 officers came out, confirmed they could hear the noise, and proceeded to check our entire property. They came back to the house to talk to us, saying again they could hear the noise, but had found nothing at all. They couldn't even get warmer or closer to any source where the sound might get louder. After they left, the noise persisted for a while, and then just abruptly stopped at something like 2:45 a.m. Never found out what it was, and never heard it again. In my early 20s I'm in college and I am bird hunting. The section I hunt is a fairly remote and is just a big loop on an old logging road. There's one way in abs out, no other way. I'm at about the halfway point and I hear someone yelling my nickname in a kind of goofy way. I'm thinking it's my roommate who decided to cut class and come out and join me. I'm at the point where way I'm going is faster than turning around to meet up with him. I get back to my car and I don't see his vehicle or anyone's vehicle. Thinking to myself, okay, he must have gotten a ride and will ride back with me, so now I circle back and don't find him. I make it back to my car and then I hear my name being yelled again. I yell back, abs, nothing. At this point I'm like, what an asshole, and decide I'ma teach him a lessons and leave, planning on coming back in an hour or so. I get back to school and he's there. In fact, all of my friends that hunt and know of the area are all there. I asked them all about it and none of them were out there. I'm truly puzzled because I know I heard my name yelled by what I thought was one of them. My roommate speaks up and said he's kind of freaked out now because he had the exact same thing happen to him there. None of us ever went back there. My family has a cabin in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania. It's deep in the state game lands, so very much off the grid and wild. I was there for a vacation with my sister, her fiancé, our brother, and my boyfriend at the time. We were sitting out on the porch one evening getting ready to play a game of Uno. For some reason, my sister and I both insisted we not start the game yet. When asked why, we both said, not everyone is here yet. We can't start without everyone. Well, everyone was at the table ready to play. We looked at each other, very confused and creeped out. She asked me if I felt as if someone was still in the cabin and I said yes. It really did feel as if someone was inside the cabin and, without thinking, we both were waiting for this someone to join us. We decided that it must have been the spirit of our recently deceased grandmother, who was the second generation to own the cabin and spent many decades vacationing there. I still get chills thinking about how real that presence was to us. I lived in West Virginia for almost my whole life, not anymore. I do miss it, it was beautiful. The forest was everywhere, it was unavoidable. We have our fair share of monsters and spirits. Most recognize the Mothman and Flatwoods Monster. But honestly, what comes out of the woods and calls you in at night is what terrified me the most. I don't know what it is, but I know I'm being watched by whatever is in that forest. I remember a few years ago I'd hear lots of weird noises in the middle of the night. It happened every night at around 3 a.m. or so. It was like clockwork. My bedroom window was around ground level. I'd often hear footsteps and see shadows pass by the window quickly. On the occasions I'd go outside to investigate, there was nothing there. I'd try to brush it off as someone scanning the house or somebody going through the trash. There's a bad opioid and meth crisis, so it's not unusual that someone would try to break in or rummage through the garbage. The shadows and sounds got harder to ignore when you'd hear unfamiliar voices calling out your name, or you'd hear a faint "help me" over and over coming from the forest. I always felt my stomach sink and I'd freeze in place out from the view of the window. There were a few nights I'd be too terrified to investigate. Something in my gut told me to not go outside. There was one specific night that the shuffling turned to more aggressive sounds. I saw the shadows pass by my window a few times, then this ungodly blood-curdling scream. I sounded almost human, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I sat frozen beneath my window, tightly gripping my machete. That was when I heard a loud bang and some metal tearing noises. The next day, the entire family was shocked to see the screen door from the back of the house was torn from its hinges and bent at a slight angle. Nobody recalled hearing it the night before. I grew up hearing to avoid the forest at dark. Once sunset hits, leave. If you think you're being followed, don't look behind you and keep going. Run if you have to. Don't respond to voices calling out for you. Every night was a terrifying experience. Even now that I no longer live there, if I hear noises outside, I stay away from the windows and refuse to leave until sunrise. Not me, but my mother lived in a pretty rural area growing up. Basically farmland, and one time walking home from school she was crossing a bridge to get home and noticed a huge black wolf dog or something waking towards her. It stopped whenever she did and then kept walking when she did. She was scared shitless but knew if she ran it would have chased her, so she kept a very slow pace. She said it was beautiful and terrifying, yellowish eyes and coat was clean, definitely not a local street dog. They eventually walked past each other and before it crossed it glanced back at her before disappearing into the distance. Ran home and told my grandpa. He drove around, warned the neighbors and anyone else walking along the road. A few of them saw it earlier and called the police, but they never found the damn thing after hours of searching with their own dogs. Couple days later some old lady was found dead in her home. She'd been gone for a while, last of her family, and was always suspected of witchcraft by the locals. 1997 or 98. Deep South. I must have been around 10 or 11 years old. Myself and 3 friends, all around the same age, were wandering around deep in the woods behind a small new rural apartment strip when we stumbled upon what had to have been some sort of old cult encampment. There was a circle of several burned out mobile home trailers, all with fire damage, busted out windows and bullet holes on the outsides, and graffiti of a dead pig's head with Stucky 666 spray painted everywhere. On the insides of the trailers, there were dozens of knives stuck into walls, sheer freaking mountains of crusty old porno magazines, mutilated Barbie dolls, beer bottles and hypodermic needles littering every inch of the interiors in layers upon layers. I can't explain it, but we all felt something extremely wrong in the atmosphere. Nobody had been to this place in probably a decade, but we still felt like we were being watched. We got the hell out of there, never really talked about it, but then a few years later in another patch of woods several miles away from the first cult camp, 2 different friends and I found another circle of burned out trailers in the middle of nowhere, almost exactly the same. They couldn't believe I'd seen something like that before, but they damn sure believed me when I said we need to GTFO of here now. Still to this day wonder WTF all that was. I wonder if those trailers are still there. And I can't help but wonder who the Stucky people were. I was once living with my grandma for a few weeks during a summer break. Our apartment was getting renovated, my mom was living with her friend, my sister was living at the lady whose son she was constantly babysitting. We had to move out of the backup apartment, and I pretty much had everything at my grandma's place. She lives in a valley village. Once during a summer, for a few days, my aunt and cousins visited. We were in the backyard, sitting around a bonfire, just talking and frying some sausages on sticks. When we were done, we noticed a bonfire on the side of the hill, at the edge of a forest. It was too far away to notice any significant detail, but one thing was certain, there were people in white robes dancing around it in circles. After a while, they stopped, and started swinging from side to side while holding hands. One of them most likely noticed us watching them, and they all ran away from the bonfire into the forest. Mind you, we don't live in America, so it definitely wasn't KKK. It was near the southern Slovakian border with Hungary. It was like middle of the summer, and there were no significant Christian or pagan events happening around that time. After it got dark like 30 minutes later, the figures were back and dancing around the bonfire. After they all stopped, they walked away from the bonfire, and into the forest. The bonfire went out some time later. I've never seen that again. It definitely was some cult, and they most likely noticed us watching them. And I know it wasn't some movie set, because we had a clear view of the field. There were no cameras present, just the people in white robes and the bonfire.